In the wake of the UK Parliament's decision to cut aid to undemocratic countries and a clear-cut agreement between the UK and fragile states on foreign aid, we decided to focus our searchlight on Western aid and grants. We're now joined by the head of International Development Committee at the UK Parliament's House of Commons, RtHonMalcolmBruce. Welcome to HOTSEAT, Honourable Bruce.
Good to see you.
Okay, let's first of all go into the very significance of the statement by your committee that you want a better agreement between governments and fragile states on foreign aid. Some activists, particularly from African states, I would say, have been advocating this sort of agreement between big donors like the UK. But now they're saying the decision by your committee is just too good, but too late.
Well, look, it is really very, very difficult because the overriding objective of UK overseas development assistance is to help poor people get out of poverty and to deliver the Millennium Development Goals. And we are concentrating that in the countries where that's most needed, that is countries that are emerging from conflict. Now, by definition, these are fragile countries with poorly developed institutions, very often bad governance, a lot of corruption, civil unrest, very difficult environment. So the dilemma always is, do you put your resources in ways that will actually help poor people, but knowing that the government isn't very effective and knowing that their rights are under threat? Or do you remove that aid because the government doesn't cooperate and leave these people on their own? And really we're saying there's a tension here. But what we did say was we shouldn't just put money in without any conditions, or put it this way, it shouldn't be unconditional. I don't think we want to say we won't put the money in until you agree. I think what we want to say to governments is we're here to help poor people get out of poverty. We're here to deliver the Millennium Development Goals in partnership with local institutions, local communities. But if you're doing things like locking up the opposition, denying a free press, suppressing human rights, that sort of thing, you're actually creating a recipe for conflict to return, and if you do that, all the aid and development assistance will be wiped out. So let's have an understanding that we're trying to do the best, and local people and local ownership is what matters, but we're entitled to say, you know, if you don't recognise some of these values, then all the good that we're trying to do together could be undone.
Okay, and your committee is quoted as telling the UK government to set in all foreign aid agreements specific conditions on governance and the circumstances in which aid will be withdrawn from recipients' countries. And so much of international aid has been wasted by governments, especially in Africa, several African countries, as you may be aware. And what sort of conditions are you trying to set now to make a difference in making sure that all these aids directed at pressing issues don't end up in the pockets of corrupt government officials, especially in Africa?
Well, obviously that is the sort of issue. Let's be clear. We're not saying there should be preconditions. What we're saying is there should be an understanding, however, that where we've made a commitment to an aid programme, if governments and government agencies openly flout basic values and undermine the effectiveness of aid, there may be consequences. We may have to either apply the aid in a completely different way or in some cases reduce it. And we've done that in some countries. We've done it to some extent in Ethiopia. We're reviewing it in Malawi. We did it once in Uganda. And if you look at a country like the DRC, there are issues there about elections. There are issues there about the possible misuse or secret deals over mining. Now, there's not much point in the UK government or other external donors putting huge resources in the DRC to deal with poverty, to deal with Millennium Development Goals, if the resources of the DRC under the control of the government are, for example, being given to their friends and not given to their own people. So we have to kind of be prepared to engage. But I just would caution, we're not saying there should be signed, written conditions. What we're saying is there should be a clear understanding that will be a continuing relationship, but has some expectations, not dictatorship, but this is not colonialism, this is a partnership, and this is for the people. But that there's a recognition that, you know, there are things that can compromise and undermine the development progress, and governments have to take their share of the responsibility.
Yeah, in view of what you just said, can we look at some of the preconditions that your committee recommended to the government?
Well, what we specifically said, and I've already mentioned them really, is if governments, for example, are denying the opposition freedom of expression, are locking up opposition politicians on inadequate grounds and without proper process, if they're inhibiting or controlling the freedom of the press or the media, if there are examples where people try to demonstrate that they're not allowed to do so, or they're beaten up, or worse still, shot, that those are the kind of underlying conditions which clearly are building up to a conflict that could wipe out all the benefits that have been achieved even in difficult situations. And I think what we're saying is if there's a repeated continuation of that kind of activity, then the UK government has got to be prepared to say, we cannot carry on delivering this aid, because otherwise you're giving you're giving poor governments sort of a carte blanche to abuse their own people, knowing that outside donors will kind of cover the gaps. But I hope you're getting the point. We do appreciate this is very delicate stuff. And we want to make it clear we're on the side of the people and we're not trying to interfere in the internal politics. But there are some fundamental rights and values that we kind of feel it's right that we as fellow parliamentarians should be saying need to be stood up for. And sometimes that's actually working to support both government and opposition parliamentarians in those countries who quite often are trying to make the same stance.
Yeah, and your statement made me to remember something that happened recently. Prime Minister David Cameron said something about cutting aid from homophobic African countries or countries generally who are like not supporting homosexual laws. And he talked specifically about African countries like Uganda, Malawi, and some people felt he was interfering in the constitution of these countries and putting into cognizance the fact that there is cultural difference between Africa and Europe. What's your take on that?
I accept that these are difficult and delicate issues, and they need to be treated as such. And I think our committee is very sensitive to that. And it is not our wish to try and impose an external set of values on countries, and we need to recognise differences in cultures. But I think we also need to recognise that on certain fundamental issues, and actually you talk about homophobic, but also about the rights of women. I tell you what, most women don't like being beaten by their husbands. And if I'm told that that's part of the culture, I'm afraid I'm listening to the women. And the same applies. It's one thing to say we're not comfortable with homosexuality. I don't think it should be illegal, but okay, it's illegal. The question is, what do you do with homosexuals? When you talk about the death penalty for being a homosexual, sorry, that's different. People are homosexual for whatever reasons, and we have a debate about that. But the idea that you should face execution because of your sexual orientation starts to become a fundamental issue. It's one thing to be in a society where it's very difficult to be gay. It's quite different, where it's life-threatening in terms of by the state. And, you know, we have to engage on these issues. But at the same time, it's working with people in the community who share those values. And it's not trying to say, we will write your laws, we will write your constitution. And that's not our job. But it's also not our job passively to say, we're here, we're helping, we're working with poor people. And those poor people are saying, I'm gay, I've got a problem. I'm a woman, I'm being beaten, I've got a problem. You've got nothing to say to me about that? Just stick to the MDGs and just deliver poverty reduction and ignore all that. And what our committee is saying is we shouldn't ignore it. Okay,
you're talking about considerable risk when you talk about AIDS. So it's like a lot of people are still confused why your committee deemed it necessary to still give AIDS to countries that are really fragile, countries like DR Congo and Rwanda.
Well, I think the answer is if you look objectively at this, first of all, our objective is tackle poverty, deliver the MDGs. Those countries where poverty is greatest, whether the number of people, both absolute numbers and proportion living in absolute poverty is greatest, are the ones emerging from conflict. There is not one of the countries emerging from conflict which is anywhere near going to reach the Millennium Development Goals. So if your objective is to deliver poverty reduction and the MDGs, the countries you have to do it in, mostly, are those states. Now that's difficult, it's risky, it's a challenge. But if we do not actually engage with those, their chances of falling back into poverty and conflict are greater, and the problems will increase. And that's why as a committee, and I think we're a little ahead of the government on this one, our government, the UK government, we're saying you cannot ignore the things that caused the conflict if you want to deal with poverty and the MDGs. So if what's going on in the country is still kind of conflict orientated, whether it's civil conflict, abuse of rights, repression of opposition, freedom of speech, repression, all those kind of things. Actually, you have to recognise that the aid and development relationship cannot ignore those things. And I think that's really the point we're making. But if you turn your back on those countries, they're even more likely to slide back into conflict because there's nobody there to help them out of it. And there's no resource to do it, because they're also by definition poor. Now, as I say, the DRC is a sort of separate case because it's not a poor country in terms of resources.
So, yeah.
So yes, I think we have to say, ultimately we expect the leaders in the DRC to be able to step up to the plate and use the resources of the DRC to help their own people get out of poverty and achieve the MDGs. To the extent that our aid and development relationship can make progress in that direction, then our committee is prepared to commit it. I think what we were cautioning in this report is if we find over time that we're not only not making progress, but there's active work amongst the leadership of the country that goes in the opposite direction, we've got to be prepared to reassess the relationship. That is the controversial bit, but it is not about writing written conditions. It's about just being sensitive and listening to the people you're engaging with, because they actually will say sometimes, why on earth are you coming here and saying you're helping us about poverty reduction, you're helping us to achieve the MDGs, but you're saying nothing about things our government is doing to us or other institutions doing to us that are making life worse for us? And I think, I don't think we want to be able to say, well, just walk away from that, we don't share your values. But we need partners. We need civil society partners, we need parliamentarians, and we need to work with them because it's their country, not our country.
Yeah, but are you not worried? Is your committee not worried about the influence of China right now in these countries you're working in? Because China is partnering so deep with them, and China doesn't have a good record when it comes to human rights. And it's a lot of people are made to believe that the UK is standing on the fence.
We're not standing on the fence. Let's be quite clear. I mean, let's not leave out the elephant in the room. European countries have raped and pilloried Africa in the past. Now, that's a long way past, but it's part of the legacy. And we're still engaged in mining and all of those kind of things. We hope in a better and more transparent, more sharing way, but that's an issue too. China, therefore, we're not entitled to say China doesn't have the right to engage in Africa and trade and invest. So our relationship with Africa, we have a partnership with China to say, look, probably China isn't going to be champions of democracy and human rights, but the rule of law matters to China, and I think we can find common ground there, and also about recognising that, if you want respect, you want engagement, you have to be prepared to listen to the people you're engaging with. So we're actually working with China to say, let's try and find some common grounds for development so that when you are investing in mining or oil extraction or what have you, you're doing it in a way that doesn't do harm to local people and gives them a fair share, and that we share some common objectives between external donors, trading partners, government, local institutions, and that essentially these resources benefit everybody and everybody gets a fair crack of the whip rather than just exploitation, leaving the people behind, without the jobs, without the share in it. And I think China are showing signs of recognising there is a responsibility there.
Let me quote the UK Secretary of State for International Development, that's Andrew Mitchell. He said, the governments make clear to countries that transparency and good governance are vital, and funding can be withheld through governments when standards are not met, as they have done in Malawi due to extravagant spending and human rights violations. And the question is, what effects does your committee think that has had on the Malawian government?
At this stage, I don't know. I mean, obviously the relationships are not good at the moment. But I think it's a case in point of saying if we'd done nothing, then the Malawian government would presumably felt that they had complete carte blanche to do what they wanted. All one can hope is that when the international community says this is not good enough, it gives perhaps local forces some opportunity to say, look, this is damaging our interest. Malawi, sadly, is a heavily aid-dependent country, and I think that we have not actually withdrawn the aid. We've said we want to withdraw it. We're having to look at different ways of applying it, and in the short run, it probably doesn't work. What DFID will often say, we do not expect countries that are struggling with all the challenges of development to deliver perfect democracy and human rights of a developed state. And let's be clear, developed states are not perfect either. And that we have to be realistic about that. But we do want to be moving in the right direction. We want to see progress. We want to see less repression, more freedom, and a more open and transparent way of doing things. So I think the problem in a case like Malawi, where we thought quite a reasonable relationship, going in the opposite direction, I think the government said we can't just stand back and do nothing. And I think that essentially is precisely what the committee is saying. You can't just turn a blind eye to blatant abuses which are working in the opposite direction from what the aid and development agenda is about. And I think there is a growing ambition amongst peoples of Africa to take control of their own destiny. And they know that that requires ability to oppose governments without being put in jail for it, ability to influence decision making, and also see whatever resources you have in your country being properly and fairly shared for the benefit of everybody and not the elite few. Now, ultimately, these are African issues, national issues for individual countries, which will have to be resolved by those countries. But to the extent that you've got genuinely friendly intervention, then we have to be prepared to work alongside the people who share those values. And it isn't an easy thing to do. You can't just write it and say, do this, 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 and this, and you've done it. It's a dialogue, it's a continuing dialogue, and sometimes you reach a fork in the road, and you say, I'm afraid we're going to have to go this way when we'd like to go that way.
Yeah, according to the DFID, fragile countries include states like Ethiopia, Sudan, Tanzania, Afghanistan, even Nigeria, DR Congo, and Ghana. Apart from Ghana, which has made significant progress both economically and politically, the other countries are not particularly progressive in democratic processes, because I'm looking at some of the countries here, they're not really making that progress. Does your committee recognize that?
Yes, we do. And I mean, I think what we're saying is it's a very big risk to put more of your resources into those countries. The outcome is not guaranteed, but part of the argument is if you put significant resources in and you can make a noticeable difference, you might help to create the climate where a more progressive society can emerge from within. And that's the sort of gamble. And you kind of, sometimes somebody said to me in Nigeria, for example, Nigeria, you have to celebrate the little gains because you have substantial setbacks, and to sort of feel that you're having some progress. And you have to challenge the leadership. You have to look for a generation of people who say, I mean, to put it at its crudest, people are entitled to ask, are the politicians here to do things for us or to do things for themselves? Now, that's the ultimate test. Now, people are critical of politicians all over the world, and they're all in it for yourself. But there are degrees of how much that's abused. And I think that this is about really saying, look, if we can get some real progress, if we can give people access to education, give people access to health, if we can give them some space, they will have the capacity perhaps to take more control of their own destiny. And if we were to walk away and gave them no such support, maybe they would just disappear into a cloud of repression and misery. I can't promise you that this intervention in 3, 5, 10 or 15 years will be transformational, but we obviously hope that we can contribute in some way or other to helping people find their own solutions and do it in ways which show respect to the views and the values of the people of the country, who ultimately have to make their own decisions and take their own destiny under their own control, but it's kind of giving them the means perhaps to do it.
Okay, let's go back to the fragile countries that we talked about earlier. Some of these countries actually do have significant economic development, just like Nigeria, which you just mentioned, but yet they are entitled to UK aid. Are there any specifics in the agreements that your committee expects from the government as part of the fact that they are booming? But it's like you're still giving them aid.
Well, I think part of it was a challenge to the UK government to be more open about why we are choosing the partners, the 8 partners we've chosen. And it's absolutely clear that in, for example, Nigeria and Pakistan, say, if we take those 2 countries, I know we're talking about Africa, but I think it's too relevant. There is a clear political interest in the UK. The relationship we've had with Nigeria and Pakistan, big players in their own region, the political connection, the diaspora issues are such that the real core reason why we are maintaining the aid and development programs at the scale we are more to do with that political relationship than a purely objective view about poverty. Whereas the DRC, for example, we haven't had that kind of relationship. So this is just us saying this is a really difficult country and we want to help. Rwanda perhaps is a sort of one that's somewhere in between. So we've asked the British government to be much more explicit about why they have selected the countries they have and to be more honest about the political reasons for going there. In the case of Nigeria, yes, they're oil rich, they're a middle income country, they should be doing better, they should be more inclusive. But on the other hand, there is now some signs of a real desire to tackle The electricity problem, we won't be able to work with that. There's understanding that education and health issues should be better delivered, and we might be able to help build up capacity. And the same applies in Pakistan. But part of the reason is we have a long historic relationship, and we would want to be able to continue to do it, and we've just got to find partners with whom we can work will help deliver it. Whereas other countries, it's purely objective altruistic. They have a challenge of poverty, they have a challenge of the MDGs. We don't have a strong political connection, but just out of, if you like, compassion and a basic desire to help these countries get on, they're getting the money. And, so there are different reasons between different countries, and we need to be more open about that.
Yeah, and let's still go back to Nigeria. Do you, because things are not really coming out as expected in terms of the economy, there's so much, like also DR Congo. Do you find a way of talking to the people who take the decisions?
Yes, we do. Of course, there's a dialogue from government to government and also regional government and civil society. There's a whole different level of engagement. And as a committee, we travel all over Africa. I completely accept that our visits are short, but they're quite intensive. And we make a point always of talking to as many people as possible. So not just our own government, but the government of the country in question at the highest level we can get. And that quite often is head of state or certainly senior ministers, but also civil society, other donors, other partners. And absolutely most fundamentally of all, just ordinary people to try and get their take on what's going on in their country. And we're always trying to make sure we do that.
Okay, talking about ordinary people, some Africans believe aid should not be given to their oppressive governments, but yet some decisions made by bodies like your committee do not go with the yearnings of the people asking that you should cut aid from oppressive governments. And it's been like this for long, and these government officials use this aid for their personal purposes. What's your take on that as a committee?
I would be very disappointed if there was substantive evidence that UK aid is abused in that way. The UK has taken a very aggressive view. We do not give direct government assistance to countries in which we don't have an open relationship with. So a lot of these countries will not get what we call budget support direct to the government. It will go through civic society, it will go through programme partners and so forth. So that's the first point. We certainly are very conscious of the fact it shouldn't displace the effect. So, because we're paying for the education programme, the President can, buy a personal jet and a fleet of Rolls Royces. That's the sort of abuse that everybody gets cross about. And we're very, very clear that we try to make sure that that's not the engagement, and that makes the difference. But, our committee has had a very robust and colourful dialogue with people like Dumbi Samoyo, but she also qualified quite a lot of what she said to our committee and acknowledged that the UK aid programme is much better targeted than many others. Doesn't mean it's perfect, it doesn't mean it's not open to criticism. But my challenge back to the people who say do that, I said, if we simply just cut our aid and walked away, would you feel better supported? Would you feel better equipped to deal with abuses that you see in your own country? Or do you think actually having international donors who share your aspirations, working with you and trying to use their influence, perhaps not getting as far and fast as you want, is a better option? And ultimately we have to kind of make a judgment as to whether we're genuinely welcome or not. And if we're not welcome, we shouldn't be there.
And let me also ask, as a committee, have you ever had instances where you felt that there is donor fatigue based on what is happening? Maybe you get frustrated by what is happening in all the countries you donate to. Yes. One of the problems is there's too many donors clambering over each other, trying to work with countries who have a limited number of administrators and have too many meetings. And then the whole Paris Convention, the Accra Accord and all that kind of stuff is about trying to deal with it. So we're very, very strong on the idea that there needs to be much more cooperation, much more specialisation, and that governments and other agencies shouldn't have to deal with an infinite variety of different donors. And that's improving, but I think it's got a way to go. And of course, budget support, where it works, is the best thing to do. It's about the donors coming together and saying, well, this is what you want to do. We're all agreed this is a good thing. It achieves the objectives that both you as the government and we as the donors want to achieve. And you've got the systems in place. So here's the money, you do it. That's the best way to do it. But you'll appreciate that there are plenty of countries where that's simply
isn't going to work. The money will be diverted. The corruption is not there. The transparency there. The capacity isn't there. So one of the other things we do is actually work alongside governments to help train their own bureaucrats, their own accountants, to actually administer funds in a more open and transparent way, so that ultimately they can take more control. You can't change these things overnight. So there's a whole different layer of things that are going on to try and achieve the best outcomes. And sometimes you get mistakes and errors and diversions along the way. But I think there's quite a lot of evidence that countries have succeeded, have made progress. And, I don't want it's very invidious when you start listing countries. But you mentioned Ghana. On other countries that perhaps aren't yet quite on the rise, but Tanzania is making good progress on budget support. Mozambique is moving in some way. They're not going fast enough, and then there are more complicated countries like Kenya, where there's some quite difficult and bad political things, but there are also some quite positive economic things. So, I think you have to be realistic. The world is a messy place, and sometimes you have to accept that. But messy doesn't mean you can't sometimes pick out values and say, come on, if we can't really move in the right direction towards these values, then this whole project's under question.
And finally, do you have an effective monitoring process, an EVS? What's been the progress report like?
Well, you can always improve. The coalition government has set up this Independent Commission on Aid Impact, which reports to our committee, not to the Secretary of State, and operates at arm's length. They have a resource, namely, they've got a support team which has far more resources than we have as a committee. But we work together. So they're only starting on this, but their idea is to go into a country and just actually follow the money and see whether or not it's going where it should be going, and what the hiccups are and what's going on, and make constructive recommendations. On the other hand, and we can work by saying, here, we've got a problem or we're not sure, and we can make recommendations to them. They agree the programme with us and they report to us. But at the same time, they will come to us sometimes and say, this is really a policy issue. This isn't about where the money's going, it's whether or not the policy is right, or whether this will actually achieve, stabilisation, or whether it will deliver. And that's a matter for the committee. So we would recommend that you look into that rather than us. So we're not getting in each other's way. I hope we're reinforcing the message. Give us 2 or 3 years, and I hope that we will have demonstrated that it is effective. And that means, by the way, that we will have some embarrassing moments, because actually effectiveness means you occasionally unearth that there's been corruption or misallocation, or something money's been wasted. But I don't think people should, throw up their hands. They should expect some of that. But at the same time, you will, I think, also have a more authoritative basis of being able to say, but this actually did work, and we've checked it quite thoroughly, and it did produce real results. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. I mean, I just can't repeat often enough that the members of my committee across parties, their ultimate interest is the activity of the UK government in partnership with the countries in which we're engaged, helping people to be less poor than they were last week, and to be better able to access health, education, employment opportunities, better quality of life. That's ultimately the test. But we also recognise that sometimes things like freedoms matter too, because if you don't have those freedoms, you maybe don't get the full benefit of it. But it is, as I say, it's complicated, but I don't think anybody should have any doubt at all that the people that matter to us ultimately are the people who statistically are shown to be the people who are the poorest, who have the least access to health and education and livelihoods. And ultimately, the test for us is, has our contribution reduced that number and improved the quality for significant numbers? If it has, then we feel we've done a good job. If it hasn't, we're obviously deeply disappointed we've failed.
Thank you very much, Honourable Bruce. And before you leave, any way people in Africa can get in touch with your committee or the DFID?
Well, I mean, they can obviously come direct through Parliament. We have a website. They can look up the website. They can see what we're doing, what inquiries we're doing. If you just sort of International Development Select Committee, House of Commons, you'll get to the website. But I'd also say to them, talk to your own MPs as well. Try and get them to find out what's going on and get their MPs to talk to us, because we want to work with them, and we feel that people should be able to go to their own MPs and say, what's the UK doing here? What's Norway doing here? What's America's doing here? And what's our government doing with it? And what's it supposed to be doing? And is it working? And I think the more people do that themselves, and the more their own MPs feel engage, the more likely, I have to say, is that we'll succeed, because you can't do it from London. It has to be done on the ground.
Okay. Thank you very much, Honourable Malcolm Bruce. We've been having a wonderful time talking about Western aid with the Honourable Malcolm Bruce of the UK Parliament's House of Commons. He is the chairman on the committee there. So thank you very much for joining us on Hot Seat. We hope to see you some other time. Goodbye.